At 7:42 on the morning of May 27, 1940, the world narrowed to a strip of broken stone and a curtain of cold mist, and I remember thinking that 5 German soldiers were about to decide whether I would live or die. Their boots crunched softly as they advanced toward my position near the French village of L'Épinay, shadows moving in and out of the fog like hunters who already knew the ending. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it shaking the cracked wall I was pressed against. My name is Tom Harlow. I was 23 years old then, just a private in Captain Jack Churchill's company, and in that moment I felt as young and as unprepared as any man could feel in a war that was swallowing Europe whole. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 36 days. Their panzers were ripping through France at nearly 40 miles a day. All along the roads toward Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force was falling back in a desperate run for the sea. I had watched officers burn classified documents in muddy ditches, watched sergeants bury weapons they could not carry, watched exhausted soldiers throw away their rifles just so they could run a little faster toward the beaches. The retreat didn't feel like a retreat anymore. It felt like the whole army was coming apart piece by piece, under the weight of a war we had barely begun to understand. I was a young man who had never seen a real battlefield before that week, and terror hits differently when you realise there's nowhere left to run. But Captain Jack Churchill was not running. Even in that chaos, he stood out like something from another age. While the rest of us clung to our rifles or prayed silently for rescue, he carried a 6-foot English longbow with a 70-pound draw weight and an effective range of 200 yards, along with a Scottish broadsword strapped to his side. I remember staring at him the first time I saw that bow, wondering how a man in the year 1940 could possibly believe such a thing belonged on a battlefield filled with tanks, machine guns and dive bombers. Yet there he was, calm as a stone in a river, studying the German patrol as they closed the distance through the mist. At 30 yards he slowly raised the bow, and the world seemed to hold its breath. I was so close I could hear the wood creak as he drew the string back to his ear, steady and sure, as if he had done it 1,000 times on some quiet field far from this war. The German sergeant leading the patrol moved with the confidence of a veteran, scanning hedges and windows for rifles, never imagining he should look for a medieval weapon. Then the arrow flew. It cut through the mist so fast my eyes barely followed it, and the sergeant collapsed without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest before he even knew someone had fired. For a heartbeat, none of the Germans understood what had happened. For a heartbeat, neither did I. All I knew was that the man standing beside me, with a bow in his hands and a sword at his hip, had just changed everything I believed about war. I didn't realise it at the time, but I had just witnessed the first, and the last, confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it came from the hands of the only man I ever met who seemed born in the wrong century, yet perfectly suited for the one he fought in. I remember sitting on the sand at Dunkirk waiting for a boat that might or might not come. The sky filled with smoke and the taste of salt and fear in the air, and I kept asking myself why any officer would bring a longbow, a broadsword, and a set of bagpipes into a modern war, until I heard a few sergeants talking about his past. They said Captain Jack Churchill had graduated from Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma, marching through jungles most of us had only seen on old maps. They said he had grown so bored with peacetime soldiering that he left the army in 1936, walked away from the career every officer was supposed to want. Then he drifted into the strangest kinds of work, editing a newspaper in Nairobi, appearing in films as both an archer and a bagpipe player, even landing a small part in The Thief of Baghdad. One of the older sergeants swore Churchill once rode a motorbike 1,500 miles across Burma and India and crashed headfirst into a water buffalo without losing his temper. Listening to them, I realised this man had lived 3 lives before the war even started. When the storm clouds gathered again in 1939 and men all over Britain returned to their regiments, Churchill walked back into ours carrying things no one had seen outside a museum. I still remember the first morning he strode into the mess hall with a Scottish broadsword at his hip, a longbow slung over his shoulder, and a set of bagpipes under his arm. The place went silent for half a heartbeat, then erupted into laughter. A few officers muttered that he was daft, and one captain joked that he must have taken a wrong turn on the way to a medieval fair. Even the War Office didn't know what to make of him. There wasn't a regulation anywhere that covered an officer bringing weapons from another century into a fight against panzers and 88mm guns. But Churchill didn't seem bothered. He acted as if the army had been waiting for him and his ancient tools all along. Now, sitting on the beach at Dunkirk, watching men throw rifles into the surf and abandon trucks, guns, and entire batteries of artillery because there was no way to save them, I could not stop thinking about him. Smoke drifted low over the water, boats came and went under fire, and the future looked as uncertain as the tide. Then I saw him making his way toward one of the rescue craft, moving through the chaos with the calm of a man walking home from work. He still had the longbow, he still had the broadsword, he still had the bagpipes tucked under one arm as if they were just part of the uniform. Most of us were returning to England with nothing but the clothes on our backs. He was returning with the full set of weapons everyone else believed belonged in a museum, and somehow it felt exactly right for the strange kind of war he intended to fight. After escaping Dunkirk and returning to England in the summer of 1940, I found myself standing at a crossroads, unsure of what kind of soldier I wanted to be after watching an entire army come apart on foreign soil, and that was when I first heard whispers about a new kind of unit. Commandos, volunteers only, men who would strike fast and hard against the enemy's occupied coasts. They said the idea came from Prime Minister Churchill himself, who wanted small bands of aggressive fighters capable of slipping ashore, causing havoc, and vanishing before the Germans knew what had happened. Something in me tightened when I heard that. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe the feeling that after Dunkirk I needed to prove to myself that I was worth more than the fear I'd carried across France. So I signed my name on the volunteer list for No. 3 Commando, expecting to meet some stern major carved out of stone. Instead, when I walked into the registration tent, I nearly lost my breath. There stood Captain Jack Churchill, the same man I'd seen carry a sword, a bow, and bagpipes through gunfire as if they were everyday tools. I remember thinking that fate must have a strange sense of humour. Of all the officers in the British Army, I'd ended up back under the command of the one man who looked like he had stepped out of a history book. Training in Scotland began soon after, centred around the wild country near Achnacarry, where the mountains rose sharp against the sky and the air tasted like cold iron. We marched 30 miles a day with full gear until our legs shook. We practiced landings in water so cold it felt like a knife pressed to the bone. We crawled through mud while live rounds cracked just inches above our heads, each shot reminding us that hesitation had no place in the life we had chosen. And when the instructors felt we were still too slow, they taught us how to kill silently, with knives, with garrots, with our bare hands, skills I never imagined I would need but learned anyway, because there was no other way to survive in the world we were entering. Through it all, Jack Churchill trained harder than the youngest man in the unit. He was nearly 10 years older than most of us, but he carried himself like someone carved from oak, tough, steady, impossible to tire. Sometimes he would bring out his longbow or his broadsword during drills, not to show off, but to make a point. On a battlefield, he told us, scaring a man can be just as useful as hitting him. Coming from anyone else, it might have sounded foolish. Coming from him, it made perfect sense. By the time winter crept toward us, talk began circulating about our first major operation, something planned against the German positions along the coast of Norway. They called it Operation Archery, and though none of us knew the details yet, I remember the feeling in my gut when the briefing came. Fear and excitement mixing into the same breath. And I remember thinking that if those bagpipes ever sounded again in the middle of battle, I would never forget it for as long as I lived. By the time December 27th, 1941 arrived, Norway's coast looked like the edge of the world. Dark water, black cliffs, and a cold that cut straight through wool and bone, and our ship rolled slowly toward it, while frost clung to the railings like white iron. We had spent Christmas at sea, the wind howling through the rigging while we cleaned our weapons, wrote letters home, and tried not to think about the fact that our first major operation, Operation Archery, would begin before the holiday warmth had even faded. The briefing had been clear. We were to hit Moy Island and South Vogsoy, destroy 4 coastal guns, eliminate an anti-aircraft battery, and shut down the fish oil factories the Germans were using to produce glycerin, all while fighting or capturing roughly 150 enemy soldiers who guarded the area. Long before dawn, as we climbed into the landing craft, the RAF began laying smoke across the shoreline, and the cruiser HMS Kenya opened fire with her 6-inch guns, each blast shaking the sea like distant thunder. The rest of us crouched behind the steel walls of the LCA as we pushed toward Moy Island, trying to stay small while the world exploded around us. Everyone stayed low, everyone except Captain Jack Churchill. He stood upright in the bow as if German shells were nothing more than summer rain. His bagpipes tucked beneath his arm, the cold wind whipping his coat while he stared straight at the shore. When the ramp slammed down into the freezing surf, he stepped forward as calmly as a man stepping off a train platform, raised the pipes, and began playing March of the Cameron Men. The tune cut through the gunfire like a blade through cloth, sharp and wild, echoing off the rocks as if a whole regiment of ghosts were charging beside us. Fear twisted in my gut, but something about seeing his back, straight, steady, unmovable, pulled the rest of us into motion. We splashed into the icy water after him, hearts pounding, boots slipping on the stones. As soon as he finished the tune, Churchill set the pipes gently on the ground, pulled a grenade from his belt, hurled it into the nearest German position, then drew his broadsword with a shout that sent all of us running. We moved from bunker to bunker, clearing them one by one while charges went off behind us, destroying the 4 coastal guns and the AA battery. At one point, we cornered a German officer and 15 of his men, and I will never forget how their hands shook when they saw the sword in Churchill's fist. They surrendered before any of us fired a shot. After Moy Island was secure, we crossed to South Vogsoy, where the fight turned into a street-by-street battle. Snipers fired from upstairs windows, machine guns swept the corners, and smoke rolled between the houses. Churchill led a flanking push down a narrow lane, and I followed close behind, firing to cover him as we drove the Germans back step by step. By early afternoon we'd blown the fish oil plants, gathered documents, and taken nearly 100 prisoners, though we paid for it. 17 commandos killed, 53 wounded, numbers that still weigh on me whenever I think of that frozen shoreline. When the battle finally ended, I saw Churchill standing on the quay with his sword stained and his pipes somehow untouched, and in that moment I understood that his ancient weapons hadn't been a joke or an eccentricity. They had helped win a very modern war. It wasn't until long after the raid that I learned what Operation Archery had done to the German High Command. Word eventually reached us that Hitler had flown into a rage, convinced the British were preparing a full-scale invasion of Norway, and he ordered 30,000 additional troops to fortify the coastline. The idea that a force of barely 300 commandos had tied down an entire army still amazes me when I think about it. Inside our own ranks, the change was just as dramatic. The man who had once been dismissed as that fellow with the sword was suddenly the talk of every officer's mess from London to Cairo. Newspapers wrote about him, senior commanders requested him for their operations, and before long Churchill was given command of No. 2 Commando, a role that pulled me along under his leadership once again. By July of 1943, we were steaming towards Sicily for Operation Husky, joining the largest amphibious landing in history up to that time. In the first 3 days, 160,000 troops went ashore, and I will never forget the feeling of stepping onto that hot, dusty beach beside Churchill, who carried the same broadsword, the same longbow, and the same set of bagpipes as if the world had not changed since Norway. The air smelled of diesel, cordite, and sunburned earth, and even with thousands of Allied soldiers pouring inland, I still found myself watching him, wondering how someone could look so completely at home in the middle of chaos. From Sicily we moved on to the Italian mainland, landing at Salerno in September 1943. Intelligence had promised a light defence, but the truth was waiting for us the moment the ramps dropped. German panzers, artillery already ranged on the beaches, and infantry dug into strong positions above the surf. No. 3rd Commando was assigned to hold the junction at Vietri sul Mar, a narrow wedge of road and rail line perched high above the Bay of Salerno. The brass told us the position was important. We learned quickly that important meant if you lose it, half the beachhead will be wiped out. For 5 days we held that ground against everything the Germans threw at us. We fired until our barrels burned hot, beat back attack after attack, and called in naval gunfire that sent shells screaming over our heads into the advancing panzers. We fought from shattered houses, from foxholes clawed into dry soil, from piles of rubble that once had names and addresses. The days blurred together into one long struggle of smoke, heat, and exhaustion, but the line never broke. Every man knew that behind us, on the beaches, tens of thousands of soldiers depended on our small unit holding this single patch of earth. When I look back on it now, I still hear Churchill shouting orders through the dust, still see his sword at his side, and I remember thinking, if Vietri falls, the whole western half of the landing goes with it. But we didn't fall. We didn't even take a step back, because behind us stood an army waiting to live or die on the ground we held. On the night of September 14th, 1943, after we had somehow held Vietri against days of German attacks, new orders came down the line telling us that the enemy had taken the high ground above the town of Melina and set up an observation post that was calling artillery directly onto the beachhead. Everyone knew that a frontal assault would be suicide. The Germans had machine guns and mortars zeroed in on every approach. While the rest of us argued about how many men we'd lose trying to storm the hill, Churchill simply said, 2 men can get through where 200 can't. He picked one corporal to go with him, told the rest of us to hold the line, and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed behind with a small group, sitting in a shallow foxhole staring up at a hillside so black it seemed to swallow the night. Every so often a distant flash lit the ridge where the German observers were, and each flash tightened the knot in my stomach. The hours dragged on, slow and heavy, and none of us spoke. It felt as if even breathing too loudly might break whatever fragile luck Churchill was walking with. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps, soft, steady, coming from the dark slope above us. I raised my rifle, expecting the worst, but then a familiar voice said, "Stand easy, lads." Out of the shadows stepped Churchill, broadsword at his hip, revolver lanyard in his hand like a lead rope, and behind him came a line of German prisoners stretching down the path, 42 in all, including an entire mortar squad. Some of the wounded were lying on makeshift stretchers pushed by their own comrades, and the whole procession looked like something out of another century. Later we pieced together what had happened from bits of rumour and the corporal's quiet grins. Churchill had slipped into each German position one by one, appearing out of the darkness with that sword demanding surrender, then using the revolver lanyard to guide the prisoners to the next group until he had gathered the whole lot like a shepherd, rounding up wandering sheep. For the action at Melina he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and when the news reached the unit no one called him crazy anymore. Or rather, if they did, it was with a kind of admiration, mad, in the way only a man who knows exactly what he's doing can be. Watching him that morning, leading a chain of stunned prisoners into our lines, I remember thinking that there couldn't be another officer on earth who would attempt such a thing, let alone walk back alive. By 1944 our unit had been shifted again, this time to Yugoslavia, where we were to work alongside Tito's partisans in a war that felt far rougher than anything we'd seen in Italy. Villages burned in retaliation, prisoners were rarely taken, and every valley seemed to hold a story darker than the one before it. From the island of Vis we launched raids along the Dalmatian coast, moving with the partisans through rocky coves and steep goat paths, and I remember how those fighters looked at Churchill, half in awe, half in disbelief, as if a man carrying a sword and bagpipes had stepped out of a legend to lead them. When orders came to seize the German-held island of Brac, the plan sounded bold but possible. 43 commandos from number 43, a troop from number 40, and roughly 1,500 partisans would land, push inland, and take the hilltop fortifications the Germans had built after withdrawing from the beaches. The night landing went smoothly. We came ashore without a shot fired, waiting only for the partisans to advance as planned. But once they saw the strength of the German positions, they refused to move until daylight. Churchill was furious, pacing, muttering, gripping his sword like he could force the attack forward by sheer will. But he couldn't compel allies who had their own way of fighting, so we waited, knowing every minute cost us the surprise we desperately needed. At dawn we pushed up the slope with Churchill at the front, and I followed with the rest of his group, climbing through scrub and loose stone while machine gun fire tore dust from the rocks around us. Mortar rounds crashed in from above, each blast shaking the ground and sending more men down. Ammunition was running low. Our small teams were thinning fast, and every few steps someone else stumbled or stopped moving altogether. Then came the salvo that broke us. A cluster of mortar rounds fell directly on the group surrounding Churchill. I felt myself lifted and thrown, as if the earth had punched upward, and when I hit the ground the world spun in a dull, ringing haze. By the time I could see straight, most of the men around me were dead or too badly wounded to move. And Churchill, who had been only a few yards ahead, was simply gone, swallowed by smoke and chaos. The order to withdraw came soon after, and we stumbled back to the boats, carrying who we could, leaving behind too many we couldn't. On the deck of the transport, bruised and shaking, I finally heard the words none of us wanted to believe. "Sir Jack has been taken." It felt like a hole had been cut straight through the centre of our unit. Everything I know about what happened to Churchill after Brack came to me years later, shared over drinks, reunion dinners, and old intelligence reports that made their way into veterans' hands. The Germans had flown him to Berlin first, convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the Prime Minister, and when they realised he had no political value, they sent him to Sachsenhausen, specifically to Sonderlager A, the compound reserved for special prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, high-ranking officers, men the Reich considered dangerous or useful enough to keep alive. It was there, in the middle of a concentration camp designed to break the strongest spirits, that Churchill and a handful of inmates, including 3 RAF officers who had survived the Great Escape, began digging a tunnel that stretched roughly 110 metres beyond the perimeter fence. They dug with spoons, scraps of metal, whatever they could hide, moving dirt in pockets and under compost piles. On September 23, 1944, 5 of them, including Churchill, slipped into the tunnel and crawled into the night. They broke into pairs once outside. Churchill travelled with squadron leader Bertram James. The two moved only by darkness, hiding during the day in thickets or abandoned sheds, living off stolen vegetables, and steering steadily toward the Baltic coast where they hoped to find a boat to Sweden. They made it almost to Rostock before a patrol challenged them. With no papers and no cover story strong enough to fool a determined sentry, they were captured and returned to captivity, this time transported to a camp in Austria, far from any Allied advance. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, Churchill and other high-value prisoners were marched south into the Tyrol, where SS units intended to use them as hostages in a last desperate bargaining ploy. But fate intervened when a Wehrmacht unit under Captain Wichard von Alvensleben confronted the SS guards, forced them to withdraw, and abandoned the prisoners unharmed in a small mountain village. Most of the liberated men waited for Allied forces to reach them. Naturally, Churchill did the opposite. With no weapon, no identification, and an injured ankle, he started walking, roughly 150 kilometres through the Alps, heading for the nearest front lines. He avoided stragglers, slept in barns and ditches, and pushed himself forward in a way that still baffles me when I picture it. After 8 days, he reached the outskirts of Verona, stumbling into an American armoured reconnaissance patrol. They didn't believe him at first. Why would anyone assume this ragged, limping figure was a British commando lieutenant colonel? But Churchill talked his way through with the same iron certainty he carried into battle, and the Americans finally accepted him for who he was. Hearing that story later, I remember thinking one thing above all, that man simply did not know how to surrender. When Churchill finally returned to England in May of 1945, the guns in Europe had fallen silent, and for most men the end of the war felt like stepping out of a burning building, but not for him. He immediately asked to be sent to fight the Japanese. He was already en route to the Far East when Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th. Nagasaki followed on the 9th, and Japan surrendered on the 15th. Years later, over drinks, someone asked him how he felt about missing the last fight, and he gave one of those dry lines soldiers use to hide disappointment. If it hadn't been for those bombs, the war could have gone on another 10 years. It was black humour. The kind only men who've lived too close to death understand, but to me it said something deeper. He wasn't built for peacetime. The army tried to fit him into administrative roles in Burma and elsewhere, but pushing paper and sitting behind desks were punishments for a man like Churchill, and everyone around him knew it. By 1947 he'd been moved to Palestine, where the British were caught between Jewish and Arab violence as the region slipped toward war. After the Hadassah convoy massacre left 77 Jews dead, the medical staff stranded on Mount Scopus were in danger of being cut off completely. Reports I later read said, Churchill helped organise and personally oversee the evacuation of nearly 700 people, doctors, nurses, students, patients, using nothing more than calm authority and that steady smile he carried through every battlefield I'd ever seen. When the British finally withdrew in 1948, he returned home again, this time to a country rebuilding itself and an army that no longer had a place for men who marched to the sound of their own pipes. In peacetime, he drifted into an eccentric rhythm that somehow suited him. In 1955, he took up surfing, not in the ocean, but on the tidal bore of the River Severn, riding that roaring wall of water for nearly a mile as if it were just another challenge to conquer. He built intricate radio-controlled model boats and piloted restored steam launches up and down the Thames. He played bagpipes at memorials with the same straight back he'd had on the beaches of Norway. And then there was the story that made all of us laugh the first time we heard it. Each evening on his train ride home from London, he would wait until the carriage passed the edge of his garden, open the window, and toss his briefcase out onto the grass so he wouldn't have to carry it from the station. The more I learned about his post-war years, the clearer it became that he hadn't lost his edge. He simply no longer had a battlefield to point it toward. Watching the world settle into peace while a man like Mad Jack tried to settle with it was a reminder that some soldiers are forged for war, and when the fighting ends, they spend the rest of their lives learning how to stand still. I was an old man myself when the news reached me in March of 1996 that Jack Churchill had passed away at the age of 89, and I remember sitting there for a long while staring at nothing, letting the years fold back on themselves. By then I'd lived long enough to see generals honoured, historians celebrated, entire wars reduced to neat paragraphs in schoolbooks, and I knew full well that Jack would never be placed beside the Eisenhowers or the Pattons of the world. He hadn't commanded armies or turned the tide of continents. But I also knew something those books could never hold. If Hollywood had written a character like him, audiences would have walked out muttering that it was too far-fetched. Yet he was real, flesh and blood, a man I had marched behind, fought beside, and survived because of. When I think of him now, 3 pictures return as clear as the morning they happened. A longbow drawn tight against the dawn light on a farm road in France. A broadsword flashing on a freezing Norwegian beach and later raised again in the narrow alleys of Italy, and the sound of bagpipes rising through mortar smoke on a Balkan hillside, stubborn and defiant as the man who played them. For those of you listening, especially the Americans my age or older, there's something in Jack's life I hope you'll carry with you. We served in an era when machines grew louder, strategies more complicated, and wars more terrible. Yet one person could still matter. One act of courage, one refusal to bow to fear or convention, could ripple farther than any of us understood at the time. Jack taught me that thinking differently wasn't a flaw. It was sometimes the only way to cut through a world determined to tell you what couldn't be done. And he taught me that memory is a duty. Men like him vanish if we stop telling their stories, and the world grows smaller each time that happens. So let me ask those of you watching, did your father serve in the Pacific, or your uncle in Korea, or your brother in Vietnam? Do you remember the oddballs, the stubborn ones, the men who didn't quite fit the mould, but who you trusted anyway when the night got too dark? Every generation has its Mad Jack, even if they don't carry a sword. As for me, when I close my eyes, I always return to one moment. Joe 742 on a misty morning near Lepinay, the first time I saw a man I barely knew draw a bow as calmly as if he were on a practice field, and loose an arrow that changed everything I thought I understood about war. I've served under many officers in my life. Only one carried a longbow, a sword, and a set of bagpipes into battle, and he taught me that sometimes, to keep the world from slipping into darkness, you have to be willing to stand out so boldly, so unapologetically, that people call you mad,